Students are moving between cultures, education systems are adapting to new challenges, and well-being is now a non-negotiable for success. But are we actually getting this right? Or are we just ticking boxes?
It tends, I think, to be a bit token. I'm not sure that we've actually gotten much further than sitting down, doing an exam and learning some information. I don't think that students have the social and interactive and interpersonal skills because they don't show up on tests.
Emma, welcome to the International Classroom podcast. Whereabouts in the world do we find you today?
Thanks very much for having me. I'm in Shanghai at the moment.
Well, we're gonna dive into some fascinating educational stuff at the moment and through this conversation. But just to get us started with this, if we were to take away any social media profiles, LinkedIn profiles, the bios, and ask you to introduce yourself in a way that speaks directly to students and educators, how would you do it?
I think I'm someone who cares very much about the child growing up into being the person that they want to be, the best version of themselves, and helping them to figure out their own path.
Succinct. There we go.
I can expand, but I was trying to be succinct.
No, I like it. Yeah, I like it. I like it. Sorry, it took me by surprise. It's a great way. I think it's been a long day. It's been a long week for me here as well. So,
because what else are we doing? I do like it in terms of what else are we doing otherwise. Yeah,
exactly. And I think sometimes we do forget that. I think educators, and I've been having these conversations with the people I work with and the group and network that I'm with here in terms of, it's so easy to forget that when you are caught up in right, I've got to get this content finished. I need to prepare them for exams. I've got a month left. What's the study? How is the prep? How, when's our intervention sessions? It's very easy to forget that you are dealing with people. And, there might be little people, but they're still people at the same time. You have to kind of kick yourself to remember that at times. And that kind of leads into this a little bit, like what you've addressed there in terms of preparing students for the globalized world. I think back to when I was in school and what I learned about, it was very much, it's probably what you had, it's English. And there was bits of history and maybe geography, but otherwise it was very localized. Yeah. And I think now, fast forward to where we are in education, we're talking a lot about preparing students for this interconnected world. But I'm interested from your side, whether you think we're actually doing that. And from that, where do you think schools are succeeding and where do you think they're falling short?
Yeah. And I completely agree that it is this interconnectedness is so important. And I think that we do it to some extent in terms of, say, the topics that we're talking about, or in terms of some of the little extras that we do in, maybe having a conversation about current events, or, in the IB with CAS, you have to do service sort of learning and other things. But one of the things that I find is that it tends, I think, to be a bit token, and I'm not sure that we've actually gotten much further than sitting down, doing an exam and learning some information to spit out into a test that gets you to the next stage in the hoop of, through the next hoop to the next stage that you need to get to. And so where I think we're going wrong with that is that because education is so competitive still. It's so much about what grade can I get to get into the university that I want to do this thing. And it's so personal and so competitive. How do you then try and get students to genuinely care about the things that are important in the world, and in terms of, other people and other things that aren't sort of useful in their exam, for example? Yeah,
and you mentioned there about the tokenism, because we in international schools, and you may have had this as well, have the International Day, and it's just one day, and it can feel very tokenistic, because what we're saying here is, how do we get true global mindedness? And obviously from an IB perspective with the learner profiles, you kind of address that a little bit more. But obviously we've got such a myriad of of curriculums being followed internationally from, I don't know, you've got sort of Indian, you've got Australian, I've seen Canadian, I've seen French, British, IB. There's a whole host of that. But the question there is like, how do we avoid that? Because what you're saying there, and I completely agree with it, is like, well, if I'm a student and my focus is on I need my HLs, I need my SLs, I need 5s and 6s, or I need these grades in A level. Why am I going to bother about this? Why should I care about citizenship or character when universities and whatnot, it's only focused on grades? Like, what do you think? How do we go about avoiding that?
Yeah, it's so difficult, and I think that this is where part of it is that the different. I don't think the different layers of our education system don't really speak to each other, because, as you say, like, the universities require certain things, and this is what they're looking for and measuring, and then it sort of cascades down. And so, what the companies look for, or sort of people in professional areas, that's what the universities then do, and that's then what the high schools do, and it sort of cascades down. So I think, in a way, it's a bigger societal conversation around like what it is that we're actually trying to do, because a high school, for example, or just a school on their own will find it very difficult to break this stranglehold on the things that you're required to do in order to get to different places. And so, but I think what schools can do, right, not in a sort of a, the problem is too big to even consider, is from really very early on, talking with families and talking with students about and exposing them to all of the different range of things that are possible, or options that are out there, and schools that are viable for them, and that being ambitious and being sort of driven doesn't mean these, 15 schools that you have to go to, and if you don't go to them, then you're a failure. And you have to start from when they're like super mini, right? You can't start that conversation when they're sort of in their first year of high school. It needs to actually come then from like the parents and the small sort of situations around what success looks like, and the fact that okay, yes, like personal sort of ambition and success and sort of self-interest in terms of what you're going to do with your life, but for what purpose? And if the purpose is sort of a bigger, collective, more interconnected thing, then maybe, the range of different pathways that are possible will become tempting and something to be ambitious for. I think our ambitions are very narrow sometimes, and that's what makes it so stressful and competitive for them.
Yeah, I mean, international schools, and even going to universities. So, yeah, I know that one exceptionally well. So let's put that into kind of a scenario then, and think about almost the opposite to what you've done. We're going to go from Shanghai to London. So let's think we've got a student who's going to go Shanghai to London for university, academically strong, but completely unprepared for the cultural and the social shift. What would you do to support them?
Yeah. And I think this is a really important problem to highlight, because I think that it's something, and you see it a little bit more, say, in the news nowadays around, say, mental health of international students and, and that shift. And I think that we don't really realize just how different it is. Like, we think, oh, you're going off into university and it's, this thing, but it's actually a huge different thing to go to a different country, let alone to go to university itself. So, I mean, the first thing is, I think that if they're already there, I mean, one thing that I would say is that part of, I think, what schools often fail to do is prepare students adequately in advance. So do you know where you're going? Do you know what it's like there? Do you know what kind of educational sort of relationship you have with people? How are you going to make friends? All of these sort of cultural and social things that students and families don't really ask themselves in advance. So if possible, I think that in high schools and with families before they go, having those sorts of questions, and then knowing and having some sort of techniques. Looks like, okay, so, if you're struggling to make friends because you don't think that anybody has any similar interests to you, this is what you can do. If you are, struggling with, even the food or other sorts of communication. So having like the tools in advance of this is where you can go. And I think that universities can also help with that. But in a way that's not assuming that all of the students operate in the way that they would want them to. So for example, a university can't just offer mental health counseling services and make that available for international students, and then that's going to sort of solve it somehow, because actually seeking help for mental health concerns and struggles is a huge social stigma in some parts of the world. So those students aren't going to look for that. They're not going to be willing to go and sort of say, yes, I'm really struggling and I need to talk to a counselor. But if there was a meetup or a club of some kind that is directed to the different sort of international student bodies that you might have, and those sort of more informal opportunities just to make connections, I think that could also be a good way, right? You're not going to go and say, oh, I need to speak to another health professional, but maybe you'll go and have dinner and cook some sort of food that you miss with people who are like you.
Yeah, and that's kind of got me thinking now in terms of when you were talking about it, and we are talking about bridging that gap between obviously high school to university. But do you think there's any other barriers, maybe invisible barriers, that students face when transitioning from education systems?
Yeah, I mean, there's the logistical ones, just practical ones. If you're going within a program from one sort of system to another, I think that they don't match up. So I think that causes quite a practical barrier. I do think that, especially probably when you're traveling internationally, the actual culture of what it means to be a student and how you learn and how you're taught is actually really different in different countries and in different systems. So even you can go down the street and have a totally different learning culture, depending on the sort of philosophy and background of the school, right? In Shanghai, you go to the American school, you go to the British school, you go to the French school, they're very, very different places. And not just because of the curriculum. It's about what does it mean to be a teacher and what does it mean to be a student is actually different. Yeah. And I think that's, and even more so than when you add in going to a different level of, say, university. And I think this is why you hear universities talking about the students aren't prepared. Well, no, they just haven't been trained in your particular brand of what you think education is, which is, it's a problem. It's not that it's not a problem, but how do you get everybody to be ready for the same thing?
Yeah, and we obviously based in Dubai, and we often have this concern about sort of the bubble that they live in. And with that, kind of pose this question then towards you about a global elite. Do we think that international schools are potentially creating a global elite where we're finding students that live in bubbles like Dubai and that struggle then to connect to real world challenges? Right? Do you see that? Do you think that's a real thing, or is that something that we kind of just say to justify students who struggle with adapting to different cultures?
I think it can be true. Even just thinking about, and it's interesting because it's a bubble, but I think it's a bubble where they think that maybe not actively, but they might sort of think that they're elite, but I don't actually think they are, because I think that what sometimes can happen is that being in the bubble, the very sort of rarefied air of international schools, and then you go abroad to some of these, different universities, both elite universities and the whole range of universities. And I was, I was talking to someone whose child just recently went off to university, and sort of called home, and she's like, "Mom, I know nothing. These people who I'm around, I studied so hard, I got really good grades, and I know nothing. Not academically, about the world and about actual social issues." And what this girl had found was that the students who maybe had been sort of maybe like more grounded in like a nation and a place and I don't know, like something. And they were so passionate and so knowledgeable about all of these issues. And all I had ever cared about was the academics and getting these grades and doing that thing. But that's not what everybody talks about here. They actually do other things.
No.
And so I don't know if that's typical of international students, but I wouldn't be surprised, because I think that we don't really get sort of in to the local community in the same way as you might if you were actually in, say, a national school where everybody had sort of some genuine sort of passions or concerns that were relevant and sort of tied to that place. Or, I mean, it could be an international issue, but if you're sort of there and rooted, perhaps it makes you more aware or more passionate. I don't know.
I'm thinking about this in my head then, and in terms of like the role of educators as well within this, but how conversations get started. And I think it's a general skill within students. It's a general skill within adults. And I get called out for this quite a lot. Like I am, when I go out, if I go out, I'm kind of quite introverted. I cannot, and this has changed as I've got older, probably maybe grumpier, but I just sometimes can't be bothered. I can't be bothered to speak to people. And what I realized is previously, and someone said this to me, it's like you're just socialed out. You spend all day talking or spend all day doing. Your social component of what you're willing to give is kind of done. I was like, that makes sense. But you start to kind of then label yourself to some extent. And then you think about, well, if I do want to go and talk to people, how do I start conversations? And I'm thinking this through in terms of from my side. If I wanted to get to know someone, like I would ask about maybe sports. I would ask about interest. I'd find something to make conversation about, whether it's what they're wearing, whether it's the hairstyle, whether it's, and that's learning to notice things to initiate conversation. And it kind of makes me think then about what we're teaching students, and had numerous conversations about SEL and all sorts of different things about what we sit probably under the curriculum, or what we call the traditional teaching of a curriculum, what we sit alongside that are underneath it. But it has me questioning, like, are we giving students the right skills in terms of when we talk about being successful in society, like actually how to talk to people? Because when you watch it now, and if you see students, how they play and interact, is they're still on screens, they're still on phones or iPads, and they're playing these games next to each other. And then they just talk a little bit, or they're talking through this. They're not necessarily skilled in holding a conversation and finding something to talk about, or a shared interest that would allow them to develop relationships. And it kind of just makes me think then, well, as the educators that we are in schools now, do we need to be mentoring students more so about how to develop skills that would allow them to flourish as a human later on in life, when they university and jobs and so on and so forth? It's just me. That's just an observation of something I'm thinking about in terms of how we develop the curriculum.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And I think that, but I think that one of the challenges is to make it not just be more, because even as you were saying, of like, you only have so much sort of social energy, or you only have so much capacity for different things. But if you think about the amount that the students are having to do, especially in those last couple of years of high school, that to make it important to take a step back and think, how do you have these conversations? How do you make these sorts of presentations? How do you ask these kinds of questions? How do you talk with somebody that you disagree with? And I think because the traditional curriculum doesn't have any time for these sorts of things, or this is what we tell ourselves, that we don't have any time to do these things in our curriculum because we have to sort of get through things. And because it's this sort of like under or side, then for the students, it's like, well, this isn't important. This is just another thing that I need to do. And I don't think that we think it's as important. So no, I absolutely agree. I don't think that students have the social and interactive and interpersonal skills because they don't show up on tests. You don't need them. because they're not measurable. And I think we've become so obsessed with everything that's like quantifiable, because that's how everything is measured, and that's all of the, what seems to be the most important things. But then, so in order to make the space, we need to take away some of that. We need to take away the sheer volume of other things that we're needing to do in schools, so that we can actually elevate that. But if that's not something that's feasible, I don't think that you could just oh, well, there's no time and therefore it's fine. Because I actually think that all teachers in their classrooms, just in their daily interactions with the students and in how they do their curriculum, can build these skills in students if they find a way, and if they focus on it, and if they make it important. And it doesn't have to be like part of an assignment. It can literally just be how you interact with the students and what your expectations are of them in how they interact with each other and you, or what kinds of assignments they do, for example.
I love what you said there. And a great man told me once that we value what we measure, but we don't measure what we value. And that kind of, I think, from listening to you there, rings true a little bit about these social skills. And they're difficult to measure and quantify, but they're probably the most important determining factors of success later on in life, I think. And for that, we use the word innovate. I'm going to use the word innovate. I don't think it is necessarily an innovation. I think it's, well, maybe so, more incremental things that need to change. And obviously you've been in a situation where you have led teams and you've mentored educators and you've built student support systems. How do you give, as we're talking about space, how do we make space to start bringing about these sort of changes, these innovations to curriculum, to allow these types of activities to be almost embedded or built in or aligned with content curriculum? How do we give staff and teachers and leaders a space to do this?
Yeah, well, it's difficult because for a lot of schools, for a lot of international schools, they have a sort of a bottom line of funding that determines the amount of time and other things that they can give to people. But I think that because educators will always talk about needing more time. So if you can't get like actual physical more time in order to make these sorts of plans, because it is about being able to think about it and plan for how you're going to do it. But I think also part of it is not making it into something that is like this big scary change, that is something that is so different. It can be little incremental ways of being in the classroom, or ways of planning different things, and having, the time to discuss this with people, the time to see it happening, and also believing that it's important, right? So you need to get buy-in from staff that this is actually their job and that this is actually important. And I think, I mean, I haven't heard this in quite a while, but, you have people who are like, oh, well, no, I just want to teach my subject. I don't want to deal with all this other stuff. And I'm like, you're not, all of that other stuff is the most important thing, whether or not they remember this history fact that I happen to be telling them in this lesson. And so I think that that's one thing. So just from the beginning of like, what is the purpose of being a teacher? If this is a priority, right, this like creating, a full human who knows how to interact and how to socialize and how to be a person, that's the goal. And the vehicle is the subject that I happen to be teaching them. And that you sort of flip it around then.
Yeah, and there's been interesting conversations taking place over these past few years that we're kind of aware to. And obviously you were mentioning there about teaching and what we bring in the classroom. And I'm interested from your side, obviously, you've got these teachers, and imagine I'm interested in developing these things, and I'm really interested in curriculum and just generally these other skills that go with it. And all of a sudden, because I'm active and proactive in my teaching, I take an interest, I might do these things. All of a sudden, it's like, oh, you'd be great as a head of subject. You'd be great as a head of faculty or head of department. And all of a sudden, it's like, well, I don't quite know. And are we too quick to try and rush excellent teachers into leadership roles? And it's kind of more of a scenario thing for you. You've got educators there with great potential, they're fantastic teachers, but they themselves may be resistant or reluctant to go into a leadership role. What do you do with that? Do you kind of try and guide them and go, hey, look, this you need to, because then you can make a big difference? Or do you kind of just go, well, actually, we need fantastic teachers to stay fantastic teachers? Where do you sit on that one?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. And because I think it really depends on the situation of the teacher themselves, but also of the sort of environment in the school that you're in. Because I'd be really interested to see why they were reluctant. Because I think that if it's that by becoming a leader, that what you end up doing is getting bogged down in admin and bureaucracy and don't actually have the power or autonomy or time to actually enact some of these things, right? So if it's like, okay, well, you could be a head of subject. Oh, that's great. Well, could I do all of this innovative things and help my team do this and my plan? Oh, no, you have to go to head of department meetings and do all of this data tracking and work this, because what is it that the job actually is? And I think that it's almost like it's a difference between a leader and a manager. Right? It's like, well, if you're asking me to be a manager and an administrator, that's one thing. But if you're a leader, I think that needs to be what the role is. So part of it could be, do we need to look at what the role is actually and what sort of, what the division of labor is within that role? So is it a genuine leadership role? What is the autonomy? What is the sort of expectations around it? And maybe that doesn't match with what they want to do. It's like, well, I don't want to do that because it's 70% administration and 30% creativity and leadership. So, or you could have the idea that, again, with like a leader, that I don't necessarily think that you need to be in a leadership position to be a leader in a school. And I think that there is sometimes this idea that if you're if you're a really great teacher, then move up into leadership in order to lead amongst the staff. But actually, for some of these kinds of sort of creativity or innovation, what have you, you can tap into it and have a lot of influence within a school culture without necessarily being in a position of leadership within the school. And in that case, I was like, yeah, fair on you. I've known people who've gone sort of up. I mean, I hate this because it always means it's just being a teacher, for example, which is not a thing. It's, they're all equally valuable, but they kind of go into a leadership position. I've done this, right? Gone into a leadership position, and then after a while you're like, yeah, this isn't really working for me. And then go back to being a classroom teacher, because that's where you feel like the magic actually is. And I can do these things that I really believe in. So it's a tricky one.
Yeah, I think it is. And, I think it's like we want, on my side of it, we want outstanding teachers, we want exceptional educators who can deliver content and know their subject, but also can develop empathy and emotional well-being, and when I say a social and emotional well-being, like we talked about, social part, because that's as equally important, and they want to bring that in. And part of being able to do that from my side is also having the encouragement and I suppose the freedom from the leadership and where you are, which kind of, I'm curious from your side, because obviously we are diving into sort of moving now towards more social emotional well-being, and I want to unpack that in your experience and knowledge of it. Do you think there are any well-being initiatives that seem good to start with but actually don't work in practice?
Yeah, I was trying to think almost the opposite of your question of, have I actually seen a social emotional initiative that I think has been really, really great? And I think that they often, sorry, that's very negative, because I think what happens is that it becomes like you can have these ideas like around, okay, we'll do this circle time sort of community thing to build this. And it can work if you have a leader or a member of staff who's like into it, that sets the right grounding and gets everybody to buy in, and you can have really powerful conversations. But then trying to take that and replicate it with everybody and all of their different things, and then it just sort of, it all falls apart, or like, I don't know, half the time it ends up falling apart. So I think one thing is this, doing it at scale is part of the problem in that ways, or things sometimes around, there's lots of these nifty little surveys and things like that, where you can sort of, it's almost like an interactive online, and there's mood trackers, and it can give you some suggestions based on the answers that you give it. And again, the sort of like, in theory, they're good, but sustaining that and actually then having genuine conversations in order to be able to apply that sort of stuff for the students, I think finding the time is really hard. I have to say that as like a full initiative that's actually sort of been implemented and seen through, it's hard I'm struggling to find one that I actually think has been genuinely successful.
And it's that follow through, I think, is what you mentioned there, is that consistency of approach, consistency of doing it. Because I think most of us know, I'll give you an example. Like, we use some of these systems and we're meant to do these surveys, but we all know that in teaching, something comes along where, something's happened, or we've got this person in, and they get pushed to the side. It's like, where can we find the space to have this? Oh, it's all right. This is a non-curriculum time. Push that to the side. See that happen a lot. But I also then have the opposing question that I'm interested in terms of whether we are focusing too much on protecting students from discomfort instead of actually teaching them how to handle it. Like we talk about these initiatives that are, some people would go, actually, it's probably too much. We're trying to protect, we're trying to shelter these students in a bubble, for example. Is that a good thing for them, or should we be allowing them to experience discomfort and teaching them how to handle and be resilient with it?
Yeah, well, and the thing is, I don't think those are necessarily sort of mutually exclusive, because I think part of actually having proper social emotional sort of education and well-being support is not making everything well for the students all the time, right? Like making sure that everything is okay, and we're going to fix everything for you, and how are you feeling, and sort of just making everything, waving my magic wand if I have that power to fix the situation for them. I think that it's about giving them those tools to be able to fix it themselves, or to be able to figure out how to do it. And so, yeah, you're right that in a way, actually, like, having a proper way of doing this includes also accountability. You need to be able to do this. And also letting them fail, right? And this is always a controversial thing in schools, where it's like, if you're going to fall on your face, then sometimes I'm going to have to let you fall on your face. And then we'll talk about it, and then we'll figure out how to, how can you, what can you do now in order to fix it, et cetera. But I can't do everything for you. And I think that this is, but it's the default, because it's, one, we care and we want them to do well, and we feel like it's our responsibility for them to do sort of academically well and get through. And I think, we do them a disservice if we mistake well-being for this idea that somehow nothing can ever go wrong for them and they have to get everything that they want. I don't think that that's the same thing.
Where do you think then, and I'm thinking about my training, and obviously I have a pastoral role as well as an academic role, but do you think there's a line that schools should be drawing in terms of how far they can go in supporting students' well-being versus stepping into areas that really should be left for mental health professionals? And we can obviously address then some schools may have counselors and whatnot, but not every school necessarily does. And I'm just curious from your side, is there a line? Are schools maybe going too far over it, or where do you think they should be?
Yeah. I mean, for one thing, I think that actually a counselor in a school is a really core role, and that it's something that certainly, like, if I was in charge of a school, that would be a priority, because I think that the best situation is when the educator can work with or alongside a mental health professional, so that you can more seamlessly, like, kind of tap in, tap out. Because I'm not a trained counselor. I can't pretend that I can, fully deal with these things. I'm trained to recognize and sort of support and direct in the right direction, but I have to have somewhere that I can direct them to. Now, whether that's internal or external is depending on the situation. But I do think that, we can't, in the same way that we can't be their friends, we also can't be their counselors. There is a line that we need to draw to make sure, and it's not easy, and there's going to be these boundaries, but I think it is important to have other outlets so that you do maintain this idea that I'm the educator, right? There's your family. I'm the educator. Your friends are over there, and the sort of genuine mental health sort of counselor is also here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. I think it's a continual challenge that we face in terms of getting that balance right between providing students with the opportunities and the resources, I think, to do these things versus allowing them to figure things out for themselves to some extent. And it's a challenge. I don't think anyone I know got the balance right yet. And every educator, for every cohort they have that's different, is always trying to figure that part out. But I want to kind of pivot a little bit now as we move into thinking about really the future of education. From your side, who's been obviously from the US to the UK to China and is coming full circle again. I'm interested to get your take on what needs to change. So if you could redesign the education system from scratch, and you can pick a country that you're in, you could pick a particular curriculum that you want, what would be the first thing that you would change?
I think, I've been trying to think about this one. I think the first thing that I would change would be the high stakes testing. And what I mean by that is these examinations where in sort of one day, in 1 hour, it sort of builds up to being the be all end all of your education career so far. And I think that in a way, and I've gone all the way around the world, in a way, the US education system is a really varied place, but being continuously assessed, where all of the work that you do, this was my experience at least quite a while ago, right? Everything that you do counts. And therefore, none of the tests were the end of the world, right? Even when you got to the AP exam, it wasn't the end of the world because it was only one little piece of the puzzle. And so I think anything that we can do to make it be almost like a portfolio or I'm not saying get rid of tests. I'm not saying get rid of all standardized tests or things like that. Not that radical, but that there just needs to be the balance and the volume so that there's no one thing that then becomes this focus. And it's not all at one point, right? It's not all when, you're 17 and a half years old and then it's just the rest of your life. It's going to turn on that one pivot. So getting rid of that pivot point or that bottleneck would be my main target.
And obviously you mentioned project-based learning there, and that's one of the progressive curriculum models we see more of. So do you think traditional schooling has kind of reached an expiration date And should we maybe be looking at moving more towards things like self-directed or project-based learning instead?
I think what's reached its expiration date is having one kind of education for the whole cohort that you have, right? And thinking that in one system, that you can have one system. Because I don't think that the traditional education system, like, the subjects that we talk about and remembered, like, that's not inherently an evil thing, right? It's just that it's not for everybody. And there are big chunks of the population for whom different kinds of learning or different ways or avenues of learning are going to be the best for them. And so being able to experiment, I do think that the choice and having projects is really useful. But I think that it doesn't have to be that, like, so therefore, like, okay, we move the whole system over to that one then, because this is what's actually going to work for all of them. And I think we're going to be having much more variety in the types of schools that we have, and that there is this choice within the systems, and that you can actually, have the best of the different worlds.
It makes me think, I've got, obviously one of the questions here is inspired by previous reading. It's a book called Range by David Epstein. And the concept there is kind of highlight what you just said, is about the generalist versus the specialist. Because obviously we're going through schooling, it's very much that almost linear, isn't it, pathway. From my experience of the British curriculum, it's year 7 to 11, and it's you kind of go down that traction. But from it, the book kind of argues that we should be potentially looking at diverse learning experiences that lead to long-term success. So I'm curious from your side, do you think we should be encouraging students to specialize early, or should they be exploring widely before choosing that pathway to go along?
I really think that students need to be exposed to a really wide range of options, and in that sense, therefore, made to sort of do a range of different things, but not for the entirety of their education. And so this is where I think I do agree. I agree with Range. I've read that as well, and I think that it's this idea that not everybody is going to do that, right? There will be some students who know what they want to do and how they want to do it, and that by making them do a whole range of different things, right, you're torturing them. Whereas the other one is that, making them go down this pathway is torturing them. And so I think that this is where the choice comes in that variety. When students ask me sometimes about, like, the different systems and things like that, I was like, if you know exactly what you want to do, the British system is great for you. Go and do A-levels so you don't have to do the rest of it. And then just do it, right? It gets you there faster. You get to become an expert a lot faster in the British education system, because you do one thing, or, well, 3 things, and then one thing, and then you're on your way. And if you have that kind of laser focus, perfect, great, good on you. But that if you don't, or that also, like, sometimes it's just that you never thought of anything else. So I do think exposure to a wide range of things is really important. And then having the option to either specialize or not is the important distinction.
Great piece of advice there. It makes me think, obviously, how we set up Key Stage 3 or is our 11 to 14s before, we start to kind of specialize. And GCSEs even themselves are specialized. Yeah. Things are on my mind at the moment regarding it in terms of what we do. But moving this on, we're on to kind of our quick fire round, as it were. So things that we've kind of prepped you with, but, we're going to go speedy. So with this, first question is, the biggest myth about student well-being
is that students aren't resilient.
Boom. Leadership advice you completely disagree with.
Never show emotion.
That one. One book every educator should read.
Oh, this was a difficult one. I found very powerful The Tyranny of Merit. I've now forgotten the author's name. But it's a little, like, kind of not too recent, a little bit controversial maybe, but it makes you think about it. This idea of a meritocracy and whether or not it's a good thing.
I'll have a look for that. Tyranny of Merit.
If you give me 1 second, I can actually find the book. It's right here. Michael J. Sandel. Sandel.
That's what I've got.
Yeah.
We will tie that. We can link that down. We will link that down there. Okay, amazing. Yeah, Tyranny of Merit. We'll add that one in. Okay, worst piece of career advice you've ever been given?
Yeah, just take the promotion because it's there.
Yeah. That one. And lastly, and this is one of my favorite ones. If education had a theme song, what would it be?
I thought about, like, it depends whether it's like the idealistic version of education or like the reality. So I thought about Another Brick in the Wall by Pink Floyd, but that's maybe the sort of like the not the slightly
that's cynical. The reality, isn't it?
That's the reality, right? Not Another Brick in the Wall. In terms of that. So yeah, something like that. Either that or like We Didn't Start the Fire, because I was a history teacher. So I always loved that. So it's just one thing after another. It's just one thing after another.
Love that song. Love that song. Right. That's amazing. Thank you for that quick fire round. Well, I'm curious now, as we kind of draw to the end of this and we reflect, what would be one thing if teachers and leaders listening could implement one of those ideas from our conversation, or one takeaway? What should it be?
I think it's that it's really important for us to step back and ask ourselves sometimes, what is it that we're really doing, and why? And realize that they're children who are trying to figure out how to become adults. And that's what we're trying to help them to do. And that you have a lot of power to help them in your classroom every day, even without that being like the focus of what you're doing. And that if you can keep that in mind, that all of those little things that you might think are really incidental or not important are actually really important. And that we just need to sometimes take a breath, and we get so caught up in like the hamster wheel of the daily madness that is schools. But just, realizing that power and that effect that you can have, and just little changes and little bits of caring and realizing the whole of what the students are doing, can, I think, make a really big difference.
Amazing. A great takeaway and great piece of advice there as well. We mentioned at the very start of the conversation that obviously you're going full circle. So I'm interested in, like, what's next? How do your plans shape out for the rest of 2025?
Yeah. So yes, we're, my husband and I are moving to the US. So that's going to be a big change. I'm expecting significant amounts of culture shock. It's been 19 years since I lived in the US. So I think it'll be a really interesting shift. So at the moment, I'm sort of doing some different projects, as you mentioned, with Q and some other things, but I'm going back into a school. I'm going to be a teacher. I'm going to teach history and TOK and psychology. And but what I'm going to keep, because I'm not having a leadership role at the moment, and I'm still figuring out how I want to be involved in education. Because one of the big things I've been thinking about this year is like, what level do I want to be involved in? Where do I want to make a difference? And so I'm going to go back into the classroom. I'm going to keep thinking about all of these different things that I've been exploring this year. And see where the path takes me. I'm not sure where I'm going to end up, but I know it's going to be in something in education. and that it'll be in the US, and the rest is a mystery.
Whereabouts in the US are you going back to?
Washington, D.C.
Nice.
Yeah.
Never been. It's one of those places I imagine a lot of other people is on the bucket list of places to go and visit.
It's quite a cool, sort of majestic, very interesting, very, diverse, great museums. We'll see. It's good. It's a good place.
And are there lots of IB, obviously it sounds like TOK, so IB schools. Are there lots of IB schools within the US?
Yeah, loads. It's like I think like the US and China have the most IB schools in the world by number or something like that. I don't know. If I'm wrong, we can fact check me, but they have a lot. So it's a very common, a relatively common program to have like alongside other ones. Right. So it's like even in like American sort of state schools, like you have this and you might have an IB program. So that's relatively common. And certainly in the international schools and that sort of thing, it's pretty common. Yeah. Well,
wish you all the best with the moves and everything going back to the US. I hope it's a tremendous success for you and keep questioning that. I love that. How do I want to be involved in education? I think it's a really thoughtful question in terms of what we're doing, like we say, the role of the teacher, the role of the educator, and what we're giving that. So really appreciate it. Thank you. It's been a wonderful conversation. Obviously there are many strings to your bow, as it were, and things we've talked about all sorts, from well-being to preparing students for international schools to leadership. I'm sure the school that you're going to are going to be very, very lucky to have you. And we want to wish you all the success with that, and just say a massive thank you for coming on and talking to us on the International Classroom podcast today. Really, really appreciate your time and conversation.
Well, great. Thank you so much for having me. And I think these sorts of conversations like having on your podcast are just a great way of keeping this sort of thinking going and keeping on, figuring it out.